Hi everyone, and welcome to a new series. This time I'm going to talk about Power Query. What is Power Query? If you've watched my previous series about Power BI, in the first episode I was describing what Power BI is and why it was created, and there was a need for self-service and automation. And I was also describing the components of Power BI. Power Query is one of them. From my experience, I find that Power Query is a very much underrated tool and is not known by a lot of the finance users. I think it should become the bread and butter of accountants, and it should be mentioned on every CV because it's one of the basic Excel skills to have. Power Query has been in Excel since 2013, so almost 8 years. If you go to the most recent version of Excel, go to Data, Get Data, you'll find here the Power Query editor, which you can open. And the first impression is that it looks a lot like Excel. You have some tabs here at the top and you have lots of buttons to click. Most of them, they seem quite familiar with Excel. Choose or remove columns, keep or remove rows, split columns, and so on. The agenda for today's episode is going to discuss what are the uses for Power Query and what is the learning curve. And then I'm going to show you a very basic example to walk you through the benefits of using Power Query. And these three benefits, I think, that are fundamental are: one, source of truth, how to connect to a data source instead of copy pasting, how to diminish the time spent on routine work with Power Query without needing to know any code at all, so just clicking buttons. And the last principle is portable and flexible solutions. You will see how new data added will be automatically imported in Power Query without you having to do anything. The main use of Power Query is what a data analyst would call the ETL process: extract, transform, and load. So Power Query is very useful where you have to extract and transform or clean up the data. One practical example would be data migration, when you want to extract data from a legacy ERP and move on to the newer ERP. But you could also use it during month end, for example, when you need to extract multiple reports and consolidate them. In terms of the learning curve, I can tell you from practical experience, at the beginning you might spend a couple of hours, 2-3 hours, to be able to automate one of your workbooks. But then as you learn more and more, you might spend just half an hour or an hour. And whether it's 2 or 3 hours or half an hour, I can assure you that time spent will make up for it, because once you have your automated solution, that will save you at least that much time every month end or every time you use that workbook. You also don't need to know everything. As with every other tool, if you get to know 70-80% of the tool, you'll be able to do most of the things you have never even imagined. And I would say you could easily acquire maybe 20-30% in just a couple of hours. We're now going to start with our example to illustrate the three principles we discussed on the agenda. So the first principle would be that we want to connect to a data source. We don't want to copy paste. So I have this simple example here when I have a trial balance which only has the profit and loss accounts. So if you were to use Excel without Power Query, you would have to open the file and copy this sheet into your workbook. With Power Query, you want to avoid that, because as soon as you copy it, there's two things happening. One, if somebody goes on and does some changes in the initial spreadsheet, you won't know about them. You'd have to open it again and copy paste. And then the second thing that happens, as soon as you copy to your workbook and you make some transformations, delete columns, filter, and so on, nobody's going to know what transformations were done. So again, you lose the connection to the data source. With Power Query, the way you do it is, start from a blank workbook, and I go here to data, get data, and here you have different ways of connecting to multitude of data sources, but I'm just going to use the simplest one, which is from workbook. And I'm going to connect to my profit and loss here. I'm going to select the first sheet, TP profit and loss, and then I'm going to click on transform data. So note here, like, I don't have to know SQL or something else to be able to connect to the data or VBA. So I just click on the buttons, I connect to the data, and then here I start my transformations. For example, I want to remove the amount year to date columns. I right click on it and say remove. And watch out what happens here on the right side. A step has been added here. So Power Query records all of the steps that you do. It's like an audit trail. So if somebody wants to see what transformations were done, they could easily go here in Power Query and see how the data was manipulated, how it was cleansed. After I finish my transformations, I'll just leave this first one to make it very simple. I'm going to close it and say keep the changes, and this will now get loaded here into a new worksheet. Watch now what happens when, for example, at the next month end, somebody comes in and adds that data to the initial file. So let's say I'm copying the rows above and just changing the period here. I'll leave the amounts as they are for simplicity. If you didn't have Power Query, if you didn't use it, you would then have to open the spreadsheet again and copy the rows that were added. You'd have to figure out which ones they were. With Power Query, it's much simpler. So watch what happens. I go here. Oh, I forgot to save, so I'd have to save the rows that I added. And then if I click refresh here, you can see that my new rows were added. But what's more important is that Power Query knows that the amounts year to date column was removed. So what happens in the background, if I go here to the Power Query editor, the steps have remained the same, but Power Query iterates over the same steps. So every time I refresh the data, Power Query would apply the same steps to the data. How cool is that? I hope you have enjoyed this short introduction about Power Query, and I hope you realize what the potential lies in it and why accountants should start using it a lot more. When you learn about Excel, you should learn about Power Query, and you should add it to your CV, as it is a powerful tool for accountants who spend so much time in Excel, fiddling with Excel, trying to clean up data, and they don't have enough time to spend on analysis and talking about the numbers. Join me in the next episodes where I'm going to be providing other use cases and some tips about Power Query. Subscribe to my channel if you like it, and leave a comment or a like. Thank you.